Yes, people, welcome back to GNA TV and Chelsea Fan TV. The last time you saw Ben, well, me and Ben at the same time, was literally at the beginning of the World Cup. Well, now it's the end of the World Cup, and we'll be talking about Chelsea, Premier League, a little bit about the World Cup as well, how we thought it went as well. But welcome all back. Thanks for all tuning as well. Make sure that you guys are smashing them likes, as always, subscribing both to GNA TV, Chelsea Fan TV as well. And let's cue the intro. Yes, people, welcome back to GNA TV and Chelsea Fan TV. I hope you guys are well wherever it is that you are across the world. And like I said just a split second ago, Ben is back with us. Ben, how are we doing, mate? How are we doing?
Yeah, really good. Recovering after the World Cup, but there's not much time, is there, with football actually back this evening as far as Premier League clubs are concerned. My team, Leicester, playing in the Carabao Cup, and then straight into the festive fixtures and the transfer window opening. So I think that sleep is going to have to wait until February the 1st.
100%. And obviously you was at the World Cup as well. I mean, what a tournament. Like we said just briefly, I thought it was one of the best World Cup tournaments I've ever seen. I mean, what were your thoughts on the World Cup, and obviously getting Argentina right like you did on the last show that we spoke about, along with obviously England getting to where we thought they probably would do anyway. But what were your thoughts on the World Cup overall?
Yeah, I think that at the beginning of the tournament, I felt and predicted as well. Never bet on it, so I'm no richer because of it. But I certainly called out Argentina to win and England to reach the quarterfinals, and that is what happened. But it's a little bit more complex than that, I suppose, because Argentina had a wobble. They lost their opening game to Saudi Arabia, and then they had a couple of matches, including an incredible World Cup final, the greatest ever World Cup final from a football perspective, but also against the Netherlands as well, a very similar pattern in regular time where the Netherlands found a way to fight back and score a late equaliser. And in both of those games, Argentina found themselves having to rely on penalty kicks, which is why Emi Martinez had such a standout tournament. And what a late save as well in extra time in the final when it was 120+3, and France could have easily gone 4-3 up, and the Aston Villa goalkeeper got down and made a big save with his left leg. So Argentina won it, but had to navigate some hurdles and some drama. And Lionel Messi again underlined, both for club and country, what a phenomenal 2022 he's had. And as a consequence, having not been nominated for the last Ballon d'Or, I think it's fair to say he's now the favourite to win that once again. And delighted really for Messi and for the Argentine fans. And I think that if you look at how they're celebrating in Buenos Aires, it's probably about 10 in the morning there now. But since about 2:30, they've been up through the night. They've been jubilant. And it's just the outpouring of joy and emotion that you won't see in too many other places. Credit to France, though, as well, because the French fans are all out too, welcoming their side back. And it was a final of fine margins. And I think that's the same with England, which again is why I say that when we analyse this World Cup, we shouldn't just sigh and say only the quarterfinals. We should look at how close England came to beating France, not just because of the Harry Kane opportunity from the penalty spot, which he ballooned over the bar, but generally speaking, England, particularly in the second half, and after the game became 1-1, bossed it. And both the French goals came a bit against the run of play, and England for large patches went toe-to-toe with the defending world champions. And had they won that game, and it's ifs and buts, and we've said this many times with many different so-called golden generations, but if they'd have got through that game, then I genuinely believe that England would have gone all the way on to a World Cup final. And suddenly it puts a completely different complexion on the tournament. And that's why I've got hope for 4 years' time. My overriding feeling is that it was the wrong approach of the English FA for many years to say Qatar's the aim to win the World Cup, because there's a mismatch there. And you can allocate Qatar if you feel like a young generation are going to come through and all be at peak age and peak form in Qatar. But obviously when they made that prediction, I don't think they preempted how young this England side would be. So yes, there's players now that are mature beyond their age, Jude Bellingham being one example. But if you add up a lot of the England stars, they're all going to be at peak age in 4 years' time. So I don't quite understand why strategically Qatar was listed as the aim if they preempted that this squad would have players like Bellingham, Rashford, Saka, Rice. Each of these players is either very young, quite young, or lacking in major tournament experience to the point where when they go over to the USA, Canada, and Mexico in 4 years' time, suddenly they're all going to be in free-flowing form. They're going to have had another 4 years together predominantly as a group. And that's why, like him or loathe him, I'm quite glad that Gareth Southgate's staying, because I think continuity at international football is underrated. So yes, some of these players weren't at their first World Cup. Others were at their second World Cup, but had predominant game time at this tournament. And some were making their debuts. And that's what gives me hope for England, that when I look at the core group, especially the midfield and the attack, and it's going to be interesting to see in 4 years' time where we're at defensively and who's in that back four and who's between the sticks. But when you look at the midfield and the attack for England and the potential and the ages, that's what gives me hope ahead of 2026. But we've said this before. We've said there's been golden generations before, and they've never quite gone all the way. So I've got hope for 4 years' time. It's a tournament of fine margins, but unfortunately, England were only able to make it into the quarterfinals.
We saw some, obviously, that France team was very weakened when you think about some of the players that weren't available to be in that team as well. And we got to see some of the young players come in and play, especially in the finals, and Thuram, the other guy up front, I can't remember his name as well. And they seem to have a very good bunch. When you look at the age of some of the players that they have as well, they seem to be set for the future, along with England, who I feel, we do have that youth still. We still have them young players coming in. Jude Bellingham's, like you said, playing. So, the future's bright for England. There's question marks over is Southgate the right manager to take us there? Some feel he is from what he's done. Some feel we could do better, etc., etc. But yeah, for me, overall, it was a great tournament. It was, I think the biggest shock one for me was just Brazil going out the way they did, to be honest, really. I expected them to go a bit further than they did, but this is the World Cup. It's a tournament. It's knockout football. And this is what made the World Cup so good and great. And there were so many good games throughout the group stages as well. Very unpredictable games. It was amazing. But we are back to talk about Chelsea. And obviously Chelsea are playing Bournemouth on Boxing Day, I believe it is. This is our first game back. Some people may say, or Chelsea fans may say, it was a bit of a blessing that this World Cup came when it did, because obviously we're not on any real great form. We've suffered from some serious injuries as well. Reece James is supposedly meant to be coming back. Fofana is another one that's returning as well, along with Carney as well. He's available as well, from what we've been told of recent. So it seems like Chelsea is slowly putting their squad back together for the next part of the season. But I want to just talk to you about, before we start talking about the players being linked to Chelsea, I just wanted to quickly talk about Christopher Vivell. And obviously this is one that we spoke about loads before on the show about it happened, when will Chelsea announce him. And obviously yourself, you brought a tweet out just to say obviously that he will join as the Chelsea technical director. Obviously has clearance to work in the UK as well. And you also said on about that Chelsea want him to start immediately, but obviously there is a calling off period in his contract. But then, even though we've appointed others as well, which we've spoken about in the past, it seems to be trying to find out from yourself if will they be ready for January, or will it be a summer thing? So what are your thoughts on the Vivell announcement and all the other appointments that we've done as well? Will they be a January sort of thing moving forward?
Yeah, the wording I used was a cooling off period, not is a cooling off period. And that was the point of debate between the clubs, because Vivell was sacked. And when you're sacked, it sometimes can trigger, depending on the wording of the contract, a different scenario. So if he had left and then Chelsea wished him to start immediately, there was a cooling off period, and that would have stopped him from joining in time for the January window. But effectively, Chelsea haven't, legally speaking, employed him directly from the Red Bull group, because he was sacked before he'd signed anything at Chelsea, and that makes him a free agent. So then it all comes down to the wording of the contract, and the contract doesn't explicitly, as I understand it, state was he to leave the club without employment, he would have to see out the full contractual cooling off period. If comparative to that scenario, he gave notice to join a specific club. So then it becomes a point of debate. And it's sort of strange because Chelsea have no reason. Chelsea don't have to go to anyone connected to the Red Bull group if they're employing a free agent. And therefore, they've always been confident that legally Vivell can start immediately. And that's their plan. And there's no reason to think why he can't just slot straight in. Unless the Red Bull group can make an argument that he was always going to join Chelsea, unless they can come back to Vivell and say there's a clear conflict of interest based upon the wording of the contract. So his previous contract becomes relevant depending on how it was worded. But speaking to sources specifically at the Red Bull group, they don't feel that there's anything preventing Vivell starting sooner rather than later, despite the fact that when he was under a contract and prior to his sacking, there was that cooling off period. So I think that Chelsea will be quite confident of getting him in as soon as they possibly can. The other delay was around a work permit. And prior to that, it was actually a back and forth. So people perhaps were under the wrong impression that Vivell was always joining Chelsea. And therefore, when those at the Red Bull group cottoned onto that, they lost trust with him and they sacked him. And that's a neat narrative, but the fact that it's taken so long now to persuade him to join tells you that it was never a 100% done deal. And the reason for that, as I understand it, is that when Chelsea went to Vivell, it was as a double act appointment along with Freund, who was the name, if you remember, that I broke a few months back, that was going to come in either by title or by nature as a sporting director style figure. And it was a double raid. And then there was that U-turn, and part of that was because Freund had only just signed a new deal, so it was a lot harder to get him out of the Red Bull group. They could hold him to a contract that he'd only just signed. So then with Vivell still wanting to join Chelsea and having had talks with Chelsea, the role perhaps changed a little bit, and the dynamic definitely did, because he wasn't coming over with somebody that he knew in a double act. He was suddenly an individual and very quickly a free agent. And I think that's been a factor in the back and forth as well about defining his role. So he'll be technical director. Remember, Lawrence Stewart also comes in as technical director, but he won't start until February. And Stewart has more of a global focus, and Vivell, for now anyway, has more of a Chelsea focus. But with a technical director, they're always kind of thinking globally. So when we say the word global, that's actually about forward planning, young talent and future talent, and making sure that the scouting network is working functionally at all levels, really, not just for youth and academy players, but even with more established players. What are the key regions that Chelsea need to bolster and strengthen in? And France, for example, is one of them. But global will eventually extend to the multi-club model. So it will mean two things. One, global network for Chelsea and forward planning windows around that. And then into that mix will come enhanced data and a better internal connection of data as well between all departments at the club. And that's data for existing players. That's projections of data around how they'll develop. That's data around injuries and preventing them, and everything being able to be accessible and structured so anyone at the football club can work out what the data is pointing towards. And this is what Tom Bowley wants, not just a multi-club model with connections, but a better internal structure as well. And then, of course, as and when Chelsea add clubs, whether they buy them, invest in them in more of a minority sense, or just partner with them, we'll start to see a split between the global members of staff that are more focused on the model aspect and the connection between Chelsea and other clubs. And then Vivell, for now anyway, who will work more under the so-called transfer committee within Chelsea, which will include people like Paul Winstanley, Kyle McCauley, Neil Bath, Graham Potter, Lawrence Stewart, and then feeding up to Ben Agbali and Todd Bowley. And it will kind of be a decision by numbers. So what you actually have is Vivell coming in as a pretty bog standard technical director, but as the model builds, his role will be more fluid. And then you have a variety of relatively equal voices. Actually, Vivell and Winstanley are probably the two most significant within the Chelsea side of the group. But Lawrence Stewart, hugely respected. And until they start buying clubs and have a split between what's the multi-club and what's Chelsea, they're all kind of doing the same thing in the short term. So I would look at the next 2 windows in 2023 more as Chelsea and everybody pushing towards that goal. And then perhaps as we head into January 2024, we'll start to get a little bit more clarity over what is multi-club model and what is Chelsea. So it's not really about worrying what a title says at the moment. It's more about the nature of creating a functional dynamic in which key decision makers can work effectively together.
There you go. That makes a ton of sense, to be honest. I know there's a question from Matty, and he'll say question, but he asked about the likes of an Edwards or a Mitchell. Is that still possible? You know, we spoke about the fact is if Gvardial or even Todd Boehly would want to have that player, that sort of person in that position, you know, in that sort of position, that role, or would they be kind of comfortable being maybe that role and using Vivell, or maybe give him a chance to later on to give him more of a, say, a broader name at Chelsea? I don't know. I mean, what are your thoughts on maybe in the summer an Edwards or a Mitchell? Do you think that's still possible with Chelsea, or do you think Boehly's not looking at that?
The first thing to say is that one sporting director or CEO of football, whatever the title ends up being, is not going to fix all or change all. And that's what makes this model quite unique, that it's being built before any individual comes in. So when Chelsea first spoke to Michael Edwards, they didn't have as clear a model. And therefore, part of the appeal to Edwards, who was blown away by the project, was being able to craft it pretty much with a blank slate. And naturally, because Boehly, before he even bought Chelsea, had spoken to FSG, he had great respect for Liverpool's recruitment model. And then Tom Glick coming in gives that perspective of a multi-club model. And we know that there's going to be a big onus on youth for both Chelsea, but also in the group sense. And that is a bit more like the Red Bull model. So it's obvious that Boehly is picking and mixing the things he likes, from the Liverpool dynamic to the Manchester City buying of other clubs and having a network, and this word that keeps coming up, pathways for players. And then the Red Bull aspect is on youth. And I don't think that it's just Red Bull find youth and develop youth, although clearly from a Chelsea point of view, that's the most important point to make. I think, as I've said many times, it's also about having that attractive model of pathways to all youth, knowing that statistically they're not all going to succeed and end up at Chelsea, but the failures can still generate you money. And that's the business aspect and the sustainability aspect, that if Chelsea are going to fund more known players and elite level players and put themselves in the battle for the Bellinghams and the Rices of this world, they can fund that off their failures in many respects, which sounds quite cutthroat, I know, but they're not going in saying, it's great, we can buy these players, we can make a profit off these players, and then we can ultimately fund elsewhere within the football club. They don't know who's going to succeed and fail. So it's not like you would buy a house that you don't like, but you just feel on the market it's incredibly cheap, and then you flip it. That's definitely not the mentality. They're not going to bring in a player that they're 100% sure has no worth, but is just an insane price, because this isn't the stock market. And that would be quite an intriguing approach, to say, well, this player's 5 million. We think he's worth 10 million, but we think he's nowhere near Chelsea. So we're going to buy him at 5 million. We're going to flip him at 10 million. We're going to provide pathways. We're going to find him the best possible club. But we absolutely categorically know that he's never going to make it to Chelsea. But that 5 million times 10 other players we're doing it for funds our January spending for a player that we do think is at Chelsea level. That is too almost financially orientated as a model. It's very similar to stocks and shares and buying and selling quickly. They're definitely not doing that. They've got absolute faith in all of their targets, but they just know statistically in football that if you sign 20, 2 or 3 might stand a chance of breaking through. And that's just the odds. And you can't predict everything, especially not when a player is 16, 17, 18 and so on. So therefore, they have a business model to ensure not only that they find the player a club through their network or beyond, but if they are clever, the players that succeed won't have cost them that much, and the players that fail will still generate income for the football club. And that will be the overall approach of the model. And then we'll see how that develops. We'll see where they buy. We'll see how quickly they buy. I know categorically France is a priority region. Sochaux, Lorient, Lyon, potentially, depending on what happens with John Textor and Angers, are all available. I think that Angers is a very realistic possibility because it's 100% for sale, whereas Lorient is probably only minority investment. I think Lyon was something that actually Tom Glick in previous roles has looked at with others, and therefore were Chelsea to move if John Textor can't get in. It looks like he might, but he keeps missing deadline after deadline. And if that became available, it might be too big for Chelsea within the context of the model that they're looking at. And Socho's still on the table, as I understand it. Nothing really advanced. And the ownership group are not that open in terms of how accessible they are to communication. But the fact that each of these clubs is at least being name dropped internally, spoken about internally, discussed internally, tells you that even if they're not moving with any speed, France is a massive region. Portugal is a relatively big region. Some will tell you Brazil as well. But my understanding is rather than necessarily diving in right now and buying a Brazilian club, it's more about making sure that they're in the race for these Brazilian and or South American players that maybe, like with Endrick, they've missed out on in the past. So that's another area to look at as well. But it will develop over time. It's not going to happen overnight. But I think now they've got a plan. So then within that plan, coming back to what you asked about Edwards, are they going to put someone at the top of that plan as sporting director? And of course, they might. But Bowley and Eghbali are very comfortable in their roles. So even if they employ somebody, I still expect them, despite the fact that Bowley could surrender his interim title, despite the fact that Eghbali doesn't even have a front-facing title other than representing the minority owners, they'll still be involved in some capacity. And then it remains to be seen, depending on how the model works, whether or not they choose to put somebody right at the top of it as clearly the overall person with the most authority. That might be a mixture of Winstanley and Vivell. Vivell, technical director, Winstanley will effectively take on some sporting director style roles, even though that's not by title. And then come the summer, it's likely that Bowley and or Eghbali will take a step back, at least as far as title, which is why they're leaving the word interim by Bowley. If he was moving in the other direction, he might have dropped the interim title by now. So I do expect Chelsea to eventually bring in somebody, but the somebody is not based upon one individual with one big reputation, which is perhaps where we were when they first took over the football club. And that's why fans were excited by Edwards or Mitchell. Now it's about dynamic. So they're not necessarily looking for the biggest name. They're not necessarily looking for somebody that, like Marina, wants to do it all. They're looking for somebody that fits within the dynamic they've got and the model they've got. And of course, that could be Edwards, because he never rejected them in terms of saying no chance. He just said the timing wasn't right. But if it isn't Edwards, it might be someone that underwhelms fans a little bit. And they're like, oh, wow, why did we go from that club? Why did we get someone young? Why did we get someone we're not that familiar with? And again, that's because, as I've said many times, the dynamic is far more important than any one singular individual.
Yeah. No, a lot of it makes sense, to be fair. I mean, there's a lot, I would say a lot, there's a small minority of Chelsea fans that are slightly less patient in terms of what Bowley's doing and you know, where we're going with things at the moment, and maybe wanting things now. And I think, you know, ultimately the thing is, there's still so many pieces of the puzzle that need to be answered, and they're trying to put it together. There's no real project or philosophy or idea of what we want to do. You might get an idea from the people that are being appointed of the route that we want to take, but in terms of actually understanding where Chelsea are going to go as a club, not just on the pitch but off the pitch as well, in terms of how they're going to do business in the future, it's something I think as Chelsea fans have to just be patient. It's not to say that it's gonna you know, not work or it will work. We don't know. That's the thing. I think it's going to be a lot different to what we had, like you said, with Marina and obviously the Roman days and the way the structure was set up there, you know. So I think for Chelsea fans at this moment in time, I think in terms of the board and what we're trying to do, and obviously what Bowley's trying to do, they obviously have an idea of what they want to do, getting the guys in and then obviously carrying it through. And then we'll be able to see slowly as we go on into the upcoming seasons, the you know, the progression and ideally hopefully the progression of the, not only, like we said, off the pitch but on the pitch as well. So we'll see what happens at a later stage with Chelsea and the board as well, and vice versa. But In terms of on the pitch, obviously we've got the January window around the corner. Chelsea, as we know, have always been very busy with this with Christopher Nkunku, and now from his likes of yourself and obviously Fabrizio Romano's, we've had confirmation that it's pretty much a done deal. Here we go, 70 million. I believe it's 70 million euros. I think it was, wasn't it? So, you know. What are your thoughts on Christopher Nkunku? Obviously, he missed the World Cup with that injury as well, wasn't able to go. He will be joining Chelsea in the summer. We don't know yet the length of the contract, the wage structure, things, the little things that some fans like to know. Know what Chelsea are doing in terms of players and sort of wage structure and things. But what are your thoughts on the player himself and obviously the signing as well?
Well, I think that Nkunku is a box office signing for Chelsea for two reasons. One, on the field, he's scored 12 goals in the Bundesliga in only 15 games. He scored 20 goals in the Bundesliga last season and 35 in all competitions. So immediately there's a player that can contribute creatively, add assists and score goals. And that's exactly what Chelsea need. So from a football sense, definitely a reason to be excited about. He's at peak age, 25 years of age, turning 25 in November. And the injury shouldn't affect too much because it puts him out for 8 to 10 weeks, something in that ballpark, which means that optimistically he'll return in mid-January and pessimistically he'll return in mid-February. And therefore, it gives him the opportunity to get fully fit because it is a summer move and then re-find his goal-scoring touch and shake off any rust because he didn't play in the World Cup and because he's recovering from injury, and then start to think about Chelsea. And Chelsea are across all of the medical side as well. So it makes a lot of sense. Now, of course, if he wasn't injured with Broja, unfortunately, out for the rest of the season, there's a lot of people that would argue, why aren't they pushing it earlier for January? But that would change the terms that were always negotiated. They'd have to pay even more if they wanted him in January. And my understanding has always been, before he got injured in the World Cup, that Leipzig and Nkunku were not in favour anyway of a mid-season move. So it was never a viable possibility. And if Chelsea, out of necessity due to injuries, wanted to change that, the whole deal will need renegotiating at a higher fee. Perhaps not significantly higher, but it all just depends, because naturally Leipzig could look at the urgency that Chelsea need goals and say, if you want him even earlier, you're going to have to pay an extra 15 million. And that then becomes crazy in the context of what he's actually worth in the summer versus now. So I don't see Chelsea somehow trying to scramble and change the terms just because of Broja. It's a summer move. And then when we talk about the contract length, we know that Todd Boehly wants 5, 6, 7-year contracts. So as I understand it, it was always discussed along those terms. There'll be a 1-year extension in all likelihood. So it wouldn't surprise me if we're talking 2026 or 2027 in terms of the contract length, but that still needs to be confirmed. And the back and forth between Chelsea and the player has been ongoing in some of these aspects, which is why when he did the medical, before things were signed, there was still some negotiation. And Nkunku was happy with the broad terms. He was happy with the broad contract. But there's like a leverage period almost where his agent can go out into the market. We're talking now 2-3 months ago and say, this is what Chelsea have offered as a starting point, and try and get somebody to counter that and then suddenly go back to Chelsea. And that ultimately is what takes a little bit of time here and there. But they've landed effectively on a deal that's pushing 70 million euros, as I first reported about a month ago now, right as the World Cup started. It's a done deal. He'll be a Chelsea player in the summer. It's as simple as that. And now we wait and see when it's announced. Leipzig's perspective is they don't really want to rock the boat. They don't really want to say, being still in the Champions League, that one of their star players is outgoing, but it's just not a very well kept secret now. So whether or not it makes much difference if they announce it or don't announce it remains to be seen. Both clubs will have to buy into an announcement if they're to do it early. If they're to do it, say, when this window opens, both clubs will have to be in favour of that. And now that his teammates know, now that virtually everybody knows that it's definite, it's signed, the industry know it's signed, other suitors know it's signed, I think that there's a chance that they'll announce it early. And that's something the Red Bull Group do with their own players, by the way. Benjamin Sesko, for example, they made sure that that announcement was out there very early, that he'd be staying within the group. So it's a possibility we'll see it announced. But if it isn't announced, it's certainly no cause for panic, because Chelsea know now that he's their player, and that is why they're across his recovery of injury. And I think that the other thing that makes it such a good signing is just how they've actually handled the whole process. And this is, again, a sign of the new model and the new era. I'm not saying that Mourinho wouldn't have taken the same approach, but Chelsea decided that they were going to pay more and effectively blow other suitors away and quickly to avoid any competition. And that's because when Nkunku signed a deal, and it just shows you that if you sign a deal, it doesn't mean that you can't exit imminently. But when he signed his new deal with Leipzig, there was a market value release clause that was arguably below the valuation by a few million. And that was because Nkunku had said to Leipzig, if I'm to sign, then the release clause has to be fair. And as a consequence, it means it can be triggered and I can go in the summer. And then in return for signing, it protects the market value, and Nkunku in that new deal gets a pay rise for a short period of time. So even though he's contracted for a long period of time, Leipzig know that with the release clause that low, it will be triggered. So they're only going to keep on to him for a short period of time, which means they can afford to give him a spike in wages. And because of that spike in wages, he then has to go to any suitor and say, well, now I'm on this. It's higher than I was before. You've got to match or better that. So then the player from his new club, Chelsea now, as we know, gets better wages out of it. So it's win-win for Leipzig to protect the value and for Nkunku to get the best possible financial package in the process. And this is why a player will often sign a new deal, even though they know they're going in the following window. And we see whether that, for example, happens also with Bellingham and Dortmund or not. And that just tells you that the contract doesn't mean a great deal as long as the release clause isn't set sky high. And that's exactly what happened. But what Chelsea did is they said, okay, you're going down that approach, so we're going to incentivize it, and we're still going to allow you to hang on to the player until the summer. But because we want it locked in now to stop any other suitors moving and challenging us, we're going to give you more than the release clause. And from Leipzig's point of view, that's an even bigger win, because they still keep him right until when they want him at the end of the season and through the business end of the Champions League, however far they get. And then Chelsea say the only caveat is, instead of triggering a release clause and the payment terms that come with that, we want the structure to be more preferable to us. And we want to be able to pay you the higher transfer fee in more installments. So Chelsea get better financial terms year on year, even though the total amount is more. Leipzig get more money, and Nkunku ultimately still gets to leave when he wants to leave. So it's actually been very well handled. And I think that that's quite a good sign as to how this new ownership group are going to operate to try and beat off some of their rivals.
It's a good move. I wanted Nkunku back in the last summer, to be honest. And I think it's a great move from our board. I don't think you can knock Todd Bowley for what he's done in this. And like you said, beating the rivals to a player like Nkunku ultimately would have just attracted so many of the top European clubs is a great thing to do. I still don't think that ultimately just signing him is enough. And this is why I think we will be busy in the summer window with other areas and positions. I know people in the chat, and then there's 300 people here saying about midfield, and we're going to talk about midfields a bit later as well. A lot of people are also asking about Leao, because Leao's an interesting one, Ben, because he didn't sign the extension before he went to the World Cup, which is what Maldini supposedly was pushing for him to try and get done so they could tie him down. He doesn't do that. And then he kind of leaves the door a little bit open. Now, we know that Broa's out, and we're going to talk about other likely strikers after him as well. But there's been talks about Leao and the potential Chelsea trying to attract him potentially in January. I don't think it's possible, but there's talks about Chelsea trying to maybe force it a bit earlier on the fact that he hasn't extended his contract. What are your thoughts? I mean, number one, have you heard anything more on Leao to Chelsea, or Leao in general, should we say? And what are your thoughts on a potential move in January for him? Do you think it's more of a summer window signing, or would it be a January signing?
I sense that it's a summer signing, not a January signing, unless Chelsea are somehow able to convince Milan that he's not going to sign, and maybe they opt for some kind of loan with an option to buy or even an obligation. But Milan are not thinking about losing Leao. That's the most important thing to state. Now, publicly, they're bound to express confidence. But even privately, sources from the Milan end continue to say pretty categorically that they believe that the player is very happy at the football club. And therefore, it comes down to finances in many ways. And we know that Milan are struggling financially, certainly comparative to Chelsea, and they're not going to be able to offer the same terms. So Chelsea are in quite a tricky position here because there's a massive release clause that they really don't want to trigger, and they won't trigger in January. There's no way that they'll open the January window and just say, here's 150 million odd euros, because towards the back end of the summer window, when that type of sky high price was being quoted, Chelsea were also not prepared to pay it. And nothing has changed in terms of Chelsea's valuation of Leao. Portugal didn't have the best World Cup, but Leao still was able to score 2 goals in 5 games. So I don't think that he did his valuation or his reputation any harm in Qatar. And Chelsea know that. They know there's other suitors, and they know that there's almost nobody in the industry that thinks the release clause is market value and worth paying. And the longer it ticks on, and the more that Leao doesn't sign a new deal, because his existing one expires in 2024, the price drops. So there's no logic, if you've got buy-in from the player, in escalating it in January to that level of money versus waiting a little bit and then either putting down a lower offer in the summer when there's even less time on the contract, or persuading ultimately Milan to drop their price because they feel that the player won't sign. And we might have a Nkunku style scenario here as well, where he signs and the release clause actually drops in the process of signing. And that would be quite interesting as well. If during the talks, it's not just about the wages and the money. So the opening offer from Milan is lower financially, as I understand it anyway, than Leao wants. But that's a starting gambit. And then they'll be back and forth. And I think Milan could, not necessarily to Chelsea's level, but Chelsea would be overpaying if they chose to massively trump the Milan offer. But I think Milan feel that wage-wise, they can make him a very fair, very competitive offer. But it's not just about wage-wise. It's about what's the release clause going to be listed at. And if, for example, it becomes 85 million euros to 100 million euros, then do Milan feel, if he has a good second half of the season, that someone will come in at that level? And do they want it that low? I know it's farcical we're using the word low, but I say low because it's basically half what it is now. And if it's set at a fair market value, even if that's still quite a high number, then obviously Leao can have his cake and eat it. He can sign a new deal like Nkunku. He can get a wage boost like Nkunku, and he can still potentially go in the summer like Nkunku. And I think Milan are quite fearful of that. So the club vantage point is that if he signs, he's signing because he wants to stay. He's not signing because he wants a short-term stay. He's signing because he's in it for the long run. And the release clause will have to reflect that. And I think the suitors are hoping that he doesn't sign and then becomes available in the summer for a lower price because of the deal expiring in 2024, or alternatively, he signs, but the signature means nothing because all it does is open up the release clause to be more viable for the summer at a rate they're prepared to pay. And Chelsea are going to have to play the waiting game, therefore. So some people in Italy are starting to speculate that he won't sign. Some Chelsea fans are messaging me saying it's definitely a done deal. It's genuinely too early for that. There's a very real possibility that he leaves in the summer. There's a very real opportunity for Chelsea to, again, move quickly in the market and get something agreed. But there's almost no possibility that Chelsea are going to be paying the release clause. And therefore, they have to wait and see and understand whether he is going to sign or he's not going to sign, because that defines everything. It defines the offer that Chelsea would make, and it defines when Chelsea may choose to move within the market.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I do think, I think you spoke a lot of sense again on this. I think the waiting game is definitely going to have to be one of them. It is interesting because he hasn't obviously agreed to sign it. Will he do that going to the summer? We'll have to wait and see. If he doesn't, like you said, it leaves it open. Again, could we see Chelsea move in January for him and kind of do like an Nkunku and try and bring him in the summer and kind of close the doors for anyone else if he has got his ideas or motives to go away from Milan potentially? But also, if we do that, obviously we know Chelsea are going to be getting rid of forwards this summer. I don't see Ziyech staying, to be honest, even though I think he had a good World Cup. Christian Pulisic. You mentioned Christian Pulisic once before about potentially being linked to Italy and Milan, etc. Do you think if he was to leave Leao, that maybe a deal like Christian Pulisic going the other way could be possible?
Well, Todd Bowley loves a swap deal, but they very rarely come off. So I wouldn't necessarily look at Chelsea leveraging a player to hit the amount, because it doesn't quite work like that, in the sense that if you don't think the market value is there for Leao at that price, then there's a full stop after that. It doesn't mean that you say, well, if we give them this player and that player, we get to the amount that they want, and then we've got a great deal, because then you're losing a player or two, and it's still not market value. So sensible clubs that think about business don't just say, well, if we can end up paying 60 million in cash and chucking in Ziyech and Pulisic, then we're there. They say, yikes, that's still a 150 million deal, and therefore it isn't market value. And it wasn't market value in cash, and it's not market value in a swap deal either, because we don't want to be seen in the market to be paying that amount, either through cash or through cash plus players. And Chelsea have to be very careful, because they've said this many times, that in the market, they're getting a reputation already under this new ownership group for overpaying. And even if in hindsight, it was worth it because the players succeed, you look at what they've done in the market. And when I speak to other scouts and sporting directors, absolutely none of them will tell you that Cucurella was value for potentially up to 62 million. And that's why Manchester City walked away at around 40 million, because they said even that's too high. Most in the industry, even before Chelsea were in the conversation, and I was making inquiries when it looked like Manchester City were the front runners, and Chelsea hadn't even had their conversation with Paul Barber, and people at other clubs were laughing and saying, he's not even worth 30 million. Chelsea have paid potentially 62 million. Chukwuemeka, 20 million. Possibly an incredible signing, someone with huge potential, but again, raised eyebrows within the industry. So Chelsea might have the last laugh on the field, but off it, it tells you that they're just prepared to pay and pay and pay. And that was what protracted out the Fofana negotiations as well, because Leicester just knew that Chelsea were the club that would spend and spend and spend. You have to look at a deal two ways. Number one, do you get who you want, and are they worth it? And number two, with a view to future deals, what message do you send in the market about how you do business? And Chelsea just need to make sure that they're seen as savvy negotiators, as tough negotiators, and sometimes walking away can be a way of doing that, which is why Anthony Gordon was a good move to not keep going up and up and up. They said, got to draw the line somewhere. And then the market says, okay, they're not panic buyers. They're not just chucking down a blank check and saying, what will it take? There is the odd exception where you just say, you know what, we'll pay what it takes. But you have got to be careful, particularly with young talent, that this is not what you're known for. Otherwise, you get caught and used within leverage, and it puts you in a very difficult position. So I think that that is probably worth bearing in mind with how Chelsea work and what they are prepared to pay when they're doing all of these deals. And then with Pulisic and Ziyech, I think that you look at it two ways. Have Chelsea got two new January signings almost in both of them, or are they going to be shipped out to allow other players, whether in January or the summer, to come in? So Pulisic, we know, was unhappy under Tuchel. Yeah. We know that his dad would have liked a move. We know that Todd Bowley roadblocked a move, certainly a loan deal, and is reticent still loaning him to a Premier League rival. We know that Manchester United inquired, but nothing more. We know that Leeds United inquired, and Jesse Marsch loves an American player, by the way, and Newcastle have looked too. So the first consideration with Pulisic is, again, are Chelsea prepared to sell or only loan? And is it a straight loan or a loan with an option to buy? And I think given that he had quite a good World Cup, they might be quite reticent. And it wouldn't surprise me if Graham Potter says, let's give him some game time and see what happens. And even more so with Ziyech, who had a better World Cup than Pulisic, an outstanding World Cup with Morocco. Not only because he contributed in an attacking sense with goals and assists, but he was a leader, he showed vision, he tracked back, he defended. And the truth is that if Chelsea get that Ziyech consistently, he will be a phenomenal player for the football club. So you're in a very intriguing position because they pre-planned before the World Cup, assuming that one or both of Ziyech or Pulisic would leave. And they've got incoming targets to, loosely speaking, replace them should the right offer materialise. But if I was Potter, and it's only my personal opinion, with both, I would be saying, let's not rush to push them out the door because they've again showcased their potential during the World Cup. So I don't think it is unrealistic to think if the right offer comes in that one or both could go. But I also think that because of the World Cup, Chelsea have got a bit more leverage on price and they've got a bit more desire to maybe make it work at Cobham and in games at Stamford Bridge. So we know Ziyech wanted Milan. Let's wait and see if that happened. It wasn't Milan for Pulisic. If he ends up moving away from the Premier League, his desire was to go to Juventus, having spoken to Weston McKennie, which might be quite ironic because McKennie could go to Spurs and they still might not be teammates, but his desire was Juventus. This was earlier in the summer window, but Juventus never came in with a loan offer or a permanent offer. And the challenge now with Juventus is that they're going through uncertainty. They're going through turmoil. They've got an investigation for financial malpractice. Max Allegri might stay. They're saying he'll stay, but certainly by the end of the season, he might go. And Juventus are not guaranteed Champions League football. So it's not as attractive perhaps as it was 6 months ago or before a ball was kicked at the beginning of the season. But Pulisic's quite intrigued by Serie A. So we're going to have to wait and see what happens. But again, my opinion, only my opinion, not something that anyone on the football side at Chelsea has told me, but my view, if I was Graham Potter, is that the first thing I would do when they return is say, and Pulisic's already back, congratulations on a great World Cup, find that form and you're straight into my starting 11.
I agree. I just think I agree in terms of maybe using him, utilising him to the summer and going from there. But I look at someone like Hakim Ziyech, I think ultimately the World Cup, again, may be coming at a good time for Chelsea in terms of market value because obviously he wasn't playing well at Chelsea, goes into this World Cup, looks very good. Some people would argue, well, he had Hakimi behind him and the system that they play benefits him. Chelsea, ideally, at the moment, aren't playing that sort of system. And I keep saying it without all our forwards. I think they're good players. I just think that they're very limited in how they play. They're not versatile enough to adapt to different systems like we see under Thomas Tuchel, for example, where he would try and switch in between games and stuff. And I just think if you've got a player that's very good at playing in a certain way, then you play it. And I just think at Chelsea, we're not doing that at the moment. I don't think even Graham Potter's doing that at the moment. I don't think he knows. I think he knows what he wants to do moving forward. I just don't think he feels by looking with the current crop of players that he's got, whether he feels that he can get them to play it, to the level that he wants to. So that's why he's maybe accommodating to play to the abilities of certain individuals and playing a system all the way to maybe a window that we can then obviously strengthen on and then maybe play, the system that he wants, preferably at a later stage. But in terms of Hakim Ziyech, I do think he'll probably still leave Chelsea. Again, market value, it works in instance of trying to sell him as well. Christian Pulisic, on the other hand, I think it's just going to have, like Kai Havertz, I think it's just going to have to have a big second part of the season. And from that, I think it will determine whether we see him go or if he stays or whatever else. And then it falls down to, like you said there, how hungry are Chelsea for bringing in other players in that position? Because if they do look to bring in a Rafael Leao and they are hungry and they do spend that kind of money, that kind of shuts the door on maybe someone like a Christian Pulisic or maybe a Kai Havertz, and maybe then they look to maybe move on and stuff. And it's we'll have to see. We'll have to see. It's going to have to be something we see at a later stage. In terms of Gvardial, now this guy was awesome at the World Cup. I mean, I haven't watched enough of him at that Leipzig, but I got to watch a lot of him at the World Cup, and he, even with his mask on, he really got stuck in. I know some people say, he got done by Messi, but it's the for me, it's the GOAT. You know what I mean? It's one of the best players in the world, and it was a great goal that Messi scored against him when they knocked out Croatia in that game. But in terms of his overall tournament, he was being great. Prior to his tournament, we were told that Chelsea had been talking to him. Fabrizio Romano's even come out and said that that Chelsea were in talks with him and they were trying to agree a deal with Leipzig on fee. We're now being told that that's 78 million, Ben. Suppose he's not now going to be enough after his World Cup performances. And other clubs have opened their eyes to this player now and looking like they may want to put in a bid for him. But in terms of the Chelsea standpoint, do you think that there's an opportunity there for Chelsea, or do you think Chelsea are not looking at maybe that area?
No, there's an opportunity. I mean, towards the end of the window, Chelsea tried to do what they did with Nkunku and get this one done early and locked in. And the pursuit of Gvardial by Chelsea is definitely appreciated by the player. He feels it's very hands-on, and he certainly senses that they see him as a priority. But there's other competition, and the World Cup is only going to increase the level of competition. PSG, Manchester United, Real Madrid, and some even say Manchester City are all clubs to watch, and that will increase the price along with his World Cup. And I think you're absolutely right that being schooled once by Messi doesn't mean anything. It's not a reflection of his talent or maturity. It was an absolutely insane Messi assist, and that's what Lionel Messi does. But Gvardiol's the right age, and now it's about getting the right price. And here is where you're going to see a lot of rumor, a lot of speculation, and a lot of gamesmanship. Because if you speak to Leipzig sources, they're starting to say 70, 80, 90, even 100 million, which is crazy for a 20-year-old, but they're fully entitled to do that. Then if you speak to suitors who entered the race a little bit earlier, particularly Manchester United, who have also scouted him for quite a while, and Chelsea, they were perhaps looking more, this is before the World Cup, around the 80 million euros mark, which is at best 70 million pounds, say, and that is inclusive of things like add-ons. And then when you actually talk to the longer standing clubs that scouted him in January or before, they start saying 35, 45 million. So there's a big discrepancy here in price. And even now, some people say the player is worth 40 million. Some people say the player is worth 100 million. And that's exactly what Leipzig want, a bidding war where no individual suitor has the same market valuation, because they can leverage all of that to get the best possible deal. And the World Cup has definitely added 10 million, I think, to his price at a bare minimum. But when Chelsea first looked at the player, and this was on their radar again under Marina last January, under the previous regime, they valued the player. This was back then, so a lot can change in a year. They valued the player, as I understand it, at 37 million. And they were not prepared to pay more than 45 million. Now we're looking at potentially double that. And when you consider that there's an outlay, it's split over a longer period because they've not triggered the release clause, but there's an outlay on Nkunku. They definitely are going to be in the race for Declan Rice. They are not hopeful on Jude Bellingham, and they're not going to get Jude Bellingham and Declan Rice, by the way. One, because it doesn't make financial sense, and two, because it's a big, big ask, especially with Champions League football not being clear for next season, to assume that your front runners and favourites are going to land both. But I think this is what fans do. Again, they say, well, we need Gvardiol, we've heard we're front runners, and then we might want two midfielders, we might still want a right back, we might even want a centre back, we could potentially add two forwards, not just one. And then who are the outgoings going to be? Well, Kante might be a free. Jorginho is not going to command the type of fee that would offset a Bellingham or a Rice to replace him in that central area. I know they're different kinds of players, but I'm just talking about midfielders broadly. Yeah. And then again, Ziyech, Pulisic, they're going to get you some money, but they're not going to get you insane money. So do the maths. If Gvardiol was to be 90 million, and then Rice was to be 70 to 80 million now, although West Ham might still allege they want more. Bellingham's going to be well over 100 million. Leao might be some kind of insane fee, close to 80, 90, 100 million. Before you know it, these players, and you've still not sorted out the defence, by the way, in the example I'm given, that's giving you a cumulative spend in January and or the summer of probably 400 million, having spent 250 million plus in the last window. It's very difficult to sustain that spending. But this is the reality of how the market works, that you don't get all your targets. So we shouldn't think that Chelsea desperately want Rice and Bellingham and Leao and Gvardiol. They're looking at all of them and they're working out who's realistic, who's market value, who wants to join Chelsea, but they know deep down that they're not going to get all of them. So the positions become more important than the name. So in January, they will want a midfielder, come what may, and a permanent midfielder. And Edson Alvarez is still on the radar, for example. And then in the summer, they'll look at other midfielders at higher prices that they know are only available in the summer, Rice, Bellingham, and so on. They desperately need a forward. They might only loan a forward because they know that Nkunku's coming in the summer. They know that Leao is available in the summer. So they might just look for a short term or a loan to get them through the season, to get them hopefully into Champions League football. And then we know that they still want to add to the defence as well. So it's obvious the spine of the team and the midfield revamp in particular is priority. Broja's injury suddenly then means that goals become even more of a priority. But clearly, these names will all excite fans, but I can categorically guarantee that come the 2023-2024 season, there's not going to be a Gvardial with a Rice, with a Bellingham, with a Leao, with an Nkunku, even though we know he's the one that is joining, because the money just doesn't add up.
No, 100%. I agree with you. And this is the thing. I keep telling people when they do this and they look at Chelsea and they look at the positions and like we're doing it at the moment. And there's one player that I do really want and I don't see it happening. Enzo Fernandez. I thought he was great in the World Cup. You know,
he was brilliant.
Player. Yeah. You know, you were right. You know, he's going to cost 100 to 120 million from Benfica. You know, and trying to get him. You said Rice. You said, you know, others. There was a mention of Amrabat, who again I thought had a great. A great World Cup in the midfield, and apparently his market value is around 30 mil, if I'm correct in saying. Obviously, that could obviously change. I mean, there is bargains out there, Ben, and this is going to fall down to the hierarchy to go and do what they need to do.
Yeah,
go on.
Well, I just think there's a few players in this category that are market value, that are affordable, that are available in the market, that are young and are midfielders. And yet people will talk about Amrabat, but Fiorentina have said that they want to hang on to him in January. Enzo Fernandez will excite, but let's not forget that he only joined Benfica recently. He's only played 24 games for them and 13 in the Primera League. So to think that Benfica would just get rid is a little bit unrealistic in the short term. So you've got to play the longer game in all likelihood in that, especially because it's not unthinkable that Ramos goes somewhere and Benfica will not want a mass exodus. Certainly, as I said before, not from a player that is new to them. And that's what they did well. They were able to preempt the development of the player, predict the market, get good market value from a 21-year-old, and the World Cup now puts him on more people's radars. And Benfica say, thank you very much. We know we can now cash in on you one day, and maybe one day relatively soon. But anyone coming in January, they're going to say, well, he's a Benfica player. He's settled at Benfica. He's enjoying life at Benfica. He's developing life at Benfica. But there are others that fall into different categories. And I think one example of that is actually Unahi, who also had a phenomenal World Cup. For some reason, people are saying Amrabat and they love him and he was incredible and he's in their team of the tournament. And I haven't actually seen if FIFA have released yet the official team of the tournament, but if it isn't out yet, it will be out soon. And I think that Unahi will be in it as well. And the reason why I mention him is because, first of all, he's been at Angers since 2021. So there's more chance of a sale comparative to Enzo Fernandez. And second of all, to that, the age is right. At only 22 years of age, he's 6 foot. He can get forwards. He can chip in with the odd goal. He's not actually known as a goal scorer. That's the irony, that in 2022, he scored a couple of goals for Morocco and he had a few long-range efforts as well at the World Cup on top of that. But in Ligue 1 for Angers, he hasn't scored this season. He only scored 2 last season in 30-plus appearances. But what you get is a combative midfielder, a tenacious midfielder. He's got good vision. He's got good anticipation. And I think that he's going to be available in the market. And the other reason I mention him is because look at the club where he's at, Angers. And look what I said before about France being important to Chelsea, about Angers being available for 100% sale. And this, again, allows you this 2-for-1. I'm not saying there's any link, by the way, and I'm not saying that Chelsea are in the mix for Unahi, other than the fact that they, like many, many other clubs, have scouted the player during the World Cup. So we don't really know what their opinion is specifically on him at the moment. But the 2-for-1 comes in the fact that, let's say you talk to the club about the player, you also look around the club, you look at the infrastructure, you realize they're available on the market. You can approach that type of conversation. And I want to make this very clear that I'm talking generally to give an example now. I'm not saying that Chelsea are doing this or will do this. but we know that Anahi had a great tournament. But what you would do in this scenario is you'd say, I'll talk to the player. I'll take a look at the club. I know France is important. I know the club's available in the market. You can have a conversation, a bit like they did with Cucurella, where they asked about Potter, a bit like they did with Paul Barber, where they bought a player, they loaned a player the other way in Levi Colwell, they sold Billy Gilmore, and all at the same time they were working out how Brighton operate, who they've got, who they might bring over, if they got rid of Tuchel, who they would turn to, and what Graham Potter was like, and gaining opinion. You would do the same in this scenario to see whether Angers is the type of club with a global cap on that you might look at. And because you always get misquoted when you try and give this context, I'm not again saying that this is Chelsea's approach or this is what they are doing, but that is the kind of player and the kind of club that definitely fits Chelsea's strategy. And Mokoko's another one that obviously falls into that category as well.
I mean, you're 100% right. And let's not be shocked if that does happen, because I do think, and a good example is Datro Fofana. Where did he come from? All of a sudden Chelsea are talking about, potentially bringing him to the football club. And we're going to talk about him in a second. But no, don't be surprised if the top marquee signing that Chelsea have in their heads for the summer isn't spoke about, and it's another. And I do think that we do need others in there. I don't think just one midfielder solves Chelsea's problems, in my opinion. I think we will look to bring in more. However, Mateo Kovacic had an awesome World Cup in himself. Looked very good in it for Croatia, and next to the Modric's as well. And obviously he will be there. But it then falls down to the Kantés and the Jorginhos. And again, we're sitting here as Chelsea fans trying to wonder: will they stay? Will they go? What are their plans? Some people saying Kanté's looking at Barcelona, then it's PSG, and then Jorginho's not sure if he's going to stay. And then we're being told he could stay. And it's just whatever we do with them, Ben, I still think we need to strengthen that midfield. We've seen enough of Jorginho, Kanté. It's not the future, is what I'm saying when you look at that with Chelsea. Especially with Kanté and his liability and his injuries, we don't know how he's going to come back from that operation that he had, if that solves it or not. Jorginho is obviously only getting older as well, and some Chelsea fans are pretty much done with him in terms of the profile player. I think he could be useful as rotation in my eyes. I don't think he should be starting games, and that falls down to us then trying to find players in the market and strengthening in that midfield. But the midfield's a real open one, because even I think for the last 1 to 2 summer window, we've always been guessing when it comes to the midfield. We've never really had this whole fixation of we're going to do this, we're going to get him. It was Declan Rice, but then back then it was we can't get Declan Rice because he's just signed a new long-term contract, and we're going to wait for that to play out, and this, that, and the other. And I still feel we're in that same bubble, Ben, when it comes to Chelsea midfields. I don't think we specifically know where we're going to do, who we're going to place Kanté with, who we're going to replace Jorginho with at the later stages. But I think it's going to be interesting to see ultimately at a later stage as well. Before we go on to Fofana, a real quick mention on Moukoko. Obviously, you spoke about him yourself. Bro is injured. We know he's going to return in the summer. We've been told that whoever Chelsea do bring in the Jan window, which apparently Graham Potter's confirmed to Bowley we need to do, isn't an ideal going to be a replacement, we've been told, for Broha in terms of the long run. We've been hearing this Moukoko guy. I haven't seen enough of him at Dortmund. Some others have. Some sent me clips and said, watch this. And, his stats, when you look at his goals and then whatever, are very good at his age and whatever. But in terms of the player himself and where he is currently at Dortmund, can you see Chelsea trying to steer a move for him in January?
I think that Moukoko is a very intriguing player because, again, he exactly fits Chelsea's mould. Their longer term strategy of buying young and developing them. And he's become quite a versatile forward now, 5'10", gets goals, gets assists, has having a really good season, 6 goals in the Bundesliga in just 14 games. And what we know about Chelsea is that when they can tie down a 18 to 21-year-old, they want to do so over 5 to 7 years if possible. And at the price at the moment that Moukoko is available on the market, there's huge appeal. But it's kind of finely poised. So he hasn't signed a new deal at Dortmund. So if we look at it now, and there still is a very realistic possibility that he signs a new deal at Dortmund. But if we look at it now, Dortmund have got 2 options. One is suitors escalate a pursuit and try and get him right now, and they take the money. And it wouldn't be a massive amount of money because the contract's ticking down. The second scenario is that, a bit like N'Golo Kante, I guess, it's a free transfer and somebody either locks in a commitment now or comes back in the summer. And there would be a crazy race for him as a free transfer. And there's already a variety of elite suitors chasing after him. And what makes Chelsea the front runner is that they've done the legwork. They had an idea all the way back over the summer upon, again, recommendation from the previous regime, but those that are now part of the new recruitment team separate to that have also looked at him and like him and seen his development this season. So you've actually got two separate scouting processes that have both pointed towards him being a target. And Chelsea, therefore, are more advanced than others because they were looking at a summer move. But what complicates the situation is that if you plan one way and he suddenly signs a new contract, then obviously the value is protected and the price goes up and the entire dynamic changes. So this is what makes January very interesting. If a suitor can get Nkunku to say, I'm not going to sign, then that suitor can potentially put down quite a low amount of money in January and say, take it or leave it to Dortmund. And then Dortmund, if they genuinely believe the player won't sign, will go, yikes, we better sell now, otherwise we're going to get nothing from him. And that is a potential strategy that Chelsea in January and Manchester United are both exploring. Then you've got Liverpool, who I don't think will move in January, but are certainly across the player and have been for quite some time. And Tottenham are big admirers as well. And then Barcelona and La Liga is a club, league, I should say, and Barcelona, a club that Nkunku really respects and likes. And the last thing Chelsea fans will want to hear is that they might again be in a race with Barcelona for a player. But Barcelona are in a different strategy because they only want him on a free. And they want to persuade the player, like they often do, wait for us, sign for us, play for us, don't sign a new deal. So all suitors now are going to have to wait and see. And his agent, Patrick Williams, has said repeatedly, both on and off record, that the deal is not close. But this, again, could be leverage. And the more suitors that come in January, the more money he can get from his client at Dortmund. So to be perfectly honest with you, if I take off my transfer cap and I just look at the player and his development and the human side and the football side, the best thing he could possibly do is stay at Dortmund until the end of the season. And if he's to do that, Dortmund will want him to sign a new deal so they don't lose him on a free. But that is how he will develop the most, because he's on fire in the Bundesliga. He's at a great club with a great fan base, good coaches, good development. The best thing he could possibly do is stay at Dortmund for a longer period. If he joins Chelsea, then he's not going to get instant game time, even with the injury to Amanda Broja, at the same level, at the same degree, at the same consistency, with the same momentum, with the same culture, with the same friendships with teammates. You know, he's a young kid, he's settled, he's scoring, and he's doing it in the Bundesliga. He should stay. And if I was advising him, that's what I would be saying. But the market doesn't work like that. So there's a window of opportunity here. But despite Chelsea's legwork, more with a view to the summer, they need to now understand if he's going to sign. And if they feel like signing is going to set back their ability to get him in the summer and the release clause is going to go too high, that's when they may work with the player to say, well, don't sign. We're going to put an offer down in January. We're going to make it clear to Dortmund they've got to take it because the player's not going to sign. So there's a range of competing scenarios that make this one quite difficult and intriguing to predict. But make no mistake, Chelsea have done more legwork than most. And that is because they had him on the radar under the new regime, under the old regime, all with a view to the summer. So now let's see whether they escalate that pursuit and try and make a bold move to get him in January.
I just think for me, it's what's the plan with Chelsea? We're signing a lot of, like you spoke earlier in the show about, there's a lot of young players coming in, and not just young, okay players. They're young, top, doing well, European, people are aware of young players, like players that are going to want to kick on, in their later 20s and be at these clubs, top European clubs, and become whatever they're going to become. And ultimately, like you said, only a handful of these players are going to really force themselves in. I don't see Chelsea stop spending in terms of certain areas. If there's a marquee signing that needs to be brought in a certain position, centre back, midfield, they'll do that still. I don't think they'll just stop spending that type of money. But ultimately, I think where we could kind of guess where we're going with this is looking at how Chelsea have, how they've done and what they've done up to this point at the moment. And you look at like Casadei, Carney, Amari Hutchinson. There's a number of really good young players at Chelsea that I think will be given opportunities, like you said. And maybe the idea is that they all, with the contracts that they're given, have incentives. And we've seen Todd Bowley do it with Broha already when he gave him the 6-year contract in terms of trying to force them into the team. But I think the idea would be try and build, into the new era with these young players and get as many as them into this first team. Equally, I don't, even if we do that, equally, I don't think it stops us from spending on big players. But at the same time, it maybe answers a lot of the questions as to why we're signing the players we are now so early. So it's like, what are Chelsea going to do? What is the idea with all of these young players? They're just going to sit in the reserves, play and have a chance in the first team on the odd couple of occasions and whatever. And then what? You sell them on, which maybe happens. Don't get me wrong. And then if that's the case, and it does come apparent that we're going down that route, but we're still just buying, then you can sit back and go, well, what's the difference between Todd Bowley and Roman in terms of what we've been doing? So that's question marks, isn't it? In the future,
it's a good point, but we have to wait and see how the strategy works, because they appear to be buying now, but once they've bought, then that will stop over the next 2, 3, 4 windows, because these 18-year-olds become 20, 21. And then at that point, you have that option to either sell them because you don't think they're going to succeed, integrate them into the first team, or they just mature and develop so quickly. And some of them are already at that level. I mean, Nkunku scoring in the Bundesliga, there's no reason why he won't be able to score in the Premier League. So he perhaps, even though he's so young, falls more into a Broja style category who could get some game time, but clearly not the same level of consistency of game time. And therefore, the strategy is basically to be in the conversation and in the market for young talents and reward those young talents with long-term contracts and develop those young talents and give those young talents pathways. And if the pathway doesn't end up being to Chelsea, as I've said many times, you still make a profit from them. So the 6-year contract and more is not out of an obligation. And fans perhaps will look at the volume of players on long-term contracts and think, yikes, so many players, so little opportunity. But the contract protects your sell-on value. So it means that you're getting a young player that, if they develop quickly, is on a comparatively modest wage compared to where their talent is going, on a long-term contract, which means you've got their loyalty. And if they work, it becomes value. And if they don't work, you can still sell them. So it will look like a lot of incomings, but that level of incomings won't be every single window. It might be for the next 2 or 3 windows, and then it might level off. And the other thing you have to consider as well is outgoings in all of these positions as well. So I'm not saying all these players will leave, but Chelsea could ultimately sell potentially a Pulisic and a Ziyech. Aubameyang might not work out. Sterling might not be happy being converted to a wing back and is a bit older. So in 2-3 seasons, who knows whether he'll still be there. Kante and Jorginho have got question marks. Koulibaly and Silva, obviously not young. Kepa could go as well. So there is space, even with players that are playing and starting and succeeding. I'm not saying all of these will go, but if we're flashing forwards 2, 3, 4 seasons, there's 7 or 8 players within the starting lineup or that will play 30 plus games this season that all could be gone, either because they want to leave or because another replacement comes along. So then when you start listing 6, 7, 8 players, for me, I'm thinking 4 or 5 of them can be developed. Slolina is a good example. 4 or 5 of them could be integrated, and you've still got room in that squad if we're flashing forwards 3, 4 seasons for 3 or 4 more experienced, established players, because that's also what you need. You can't buy 8 wonder kids at 18 to 20 and say in 3 seasons' time they'll all be in. But what you can do is gamble on 1 or 2 big names that you think are ready in a season or 2. Gamble on 1 or 2. I mean, gamble's the wrong word because they're scouting with huge levels of specifics and science, but obviously there's always a bit of a gamble with a young player. So you're hoping 1 or 2 to break in now, 1 or 2 to break in next season, and 1 or 2 to break in 2 or 3 seasons. And you've got to find pathways for them. Broja's a good example. He's been out on loan a couple of times. Now if he was fit, would be in an integration season. And the following season, you're hoping for your return and your consistency. So you can see the kind of plan.
Yeah.
But obviously, you also have to factor in that right now they seem to be buying more than they're selling. But in 2-3 seasons' time, a lot of these players that you just see as default starters or 30-plus games a season might not be at the football club. You could certainly say that for Koulibaly in 3 seasons' time. You could certainly say that for Silva in less than 3 seasons' time. You could definitely say that for Kante, Jorginho, and Kepa. And arguably, you could put Sterling, Pulisic, Ziyech, and Aubameyang into that conversation.
True, 100%. I agree with that. Just wanted to finish off with one more topic that I want to talk about. Datro Fofana to Chelsea. Now, kind of came out of the blue again. We're being linked with a player from Mould. He's an Ivorian striker. Some people are thinking back to 2004 onwards of Didier Drogba, and he's links to Chelsea, obviously being an Ivory Coast player and stuff. And they're thinking, oh, is it the new Didier Drogba that was coming in and that? And obviously, I haven't seen much of this guy, Ben. I'm not going to lie. It come out of the blue. I was like, who is this guy? I've done a little bit of research on him, watched a bit about him. Looks like a very good player. Equally, I see a video of him on Twitter saying that his dream move would be Chelsea. And, you know, and all of a sudden, it seems like Chelsea may be looking to do that in the January window. I mean, what have you heard on Datro Fofana to Chelsea? And again, what are Chelsea going to do with him? Is he another one of, well, he comes in, he's young, you know, he'll be given the opportunity to get into this team at some point? Like, what's the aim with him?
Yeah, I think the situation is that Chelsea are pretty close to signing Datro Fofana. There's certainly a club-to-club agreement in place with Mulder. And now it's just about not only the personal terms, because people naturally think that means finances, but again, the P for pathway, which we're going to hear a lot over and over again. The fee will be about 8.5 million. There'll be a sell-on clause for Mulder. And this all comes from the fact that who almost got a deal done a few months back, Brighton and Hove Albion. So this is very much a Graham Potter signing. It's very much a Carl McCauley signing. It's very much a Paul Winstanley signing. And I think in convincing Fofana, it is going to be about that pathway, because the level of clubs that were looking at him prior to Chelsea entering the conversation were smaller than Chelsea. And therefore, the opportunity to be integrated into the first team and get game time was higher. Far more chance of playing more games this season for Brighton than Chelsea. And this is the change. And I think this is going to be the hardest part of the job for Graham Potter. It's only my opinion that he's known to be a man manager, and he's always worked comparative to Chelsea at smaller clubs with smaller squads. So when you sign a young player, you can develop them, you can be very hands-on. Now Graham Potter's finding at Chelsea, and this isn't a criticism, by the way, it's just the nature of the big club. He's got bigger squads, he's got bigger egos, he's got more games, he's got less thinking time, and he's got far more decision makers around him, some of whom he's brought in and others that were already at Chelsea. So the pathway and the plan for a player like Datro Fofana is completely different at Chelsea compared to Brighton. And it wouldn't remotely surprise me, therefore, if should Datro Fofana sign, and it's looking likely, he's loaned back to Mulder or he's loaned to another Premier League club, because there's other suitors within the Premier League. Brentford is another example. Leicester is another example. They've all looked at him. And the only way that I can see a player like Datro Fofana developing is in getting game time. And I don't think he's quite there at that Chelsea level. So people will say it's about bringing in a youngster who can fill the void left by Broja. But I'm not so sure at this stage. So his stats look good, by the way. He's won a league title already. He's got, I think, 15 goals in 24 appearances. And there will be comparisons made, as you said in your question, with Didier Drogba. But I don't think that, given where Chelsea are right now, he would be getting much Premier League game time. So it wouldn't remotely surprise me if, again, there's a longer term plan for a player that's still only 19. He turns 20 on, I think it's December the 22nd off the top of my head. He's got all the attributes you need. He has good positional sense. He's won a cap already for the Ivory Coast, and he's having a tremendous season. It's not just those goals in the league. In all competitions, he's scored 22 goals. And that just tells you that he's found that kind of poacher's instinct, which is exactly what Chelsea believe that can be developed. And now he needs to mature. Now he needs to work out how to run a bit more off the ball. Now he needs to work out how he can kind of develop a multifaceted aspect to his game. And one area in particular, I think, along with the movement off the ball, is also just understanding that more versatile system that Chelsea and others play. So I think what he is able to do is drop deeper into midfield and play as a traditional striker. Yeah. And what he's also able to do is score goals in the box. What he's less good at from looking at him is when other more versatile players with freedom are moving around him, preempting and predicting those movements. So if you're going to be playing a Mount, a Pulisic, a Sterling, and they're all going to be floating around, they're going to be given freedom, you're going to be playing with width, you're going to be playing with a front two, you're going to be playing in a 4-2-3-1, those kind of formations. This is where he needs to develop and work out when he needs to be rigid, when he needs to be in the box, and when he needs to move to accommodate and complement another player that is more versatile, and how that formational movement and positional sense shifts because of what other players, elite level players with freedom, are doing on the field. And again, that's not a criticism. You don't get that without working with great players and preempting them and being at a big club. But what that means is, unlike Broja, who I think has had more time to develop in that system, he would need that ability and that game time. And I don't see him getting that at Chelsea Football Club. So we're going to have to wait and see should he sign, what the plan is. But I think this is encouraging because the signing is born out of that Brighton interest, that Potter interest, that Macaulay interest, that Winstanley interest, if you like. And therefore, should he join, what we again are seeing is Todd Boehly and Bedag Eghbali changing their list of targets and their approach, not just because of the Broja injury, but because of the new manager and the new recruitment team, which perhaps is an indication, again, of some managerial authority to suggest once again, contrary to what you may read, contrary to the panic that you may see on social media, that this is not about Boehly and Eghbali playing Football Manager. This is about them listening and reacting to the experts around them.
Does it really solve the short-term issue that Chelsea have, though? Because you're bringing in a Fofana, Moukoko, we were talked that they may not play much anyway. So does that mean Chelsea are looking maybe at someone with a bit more of a taste for goal that's a bit more known, just to come in the short term? So potentially bringing in Fofana doesn't mean Fofana is the replacement for Broja, is what we're saying right now.
Yeah, exactly. Well, like Broja's not being replaced. Broja's just injured. And that's the main thing. That the last thing that Broja will want is to feel like he's out for half a season. And then when he gets fit, there's a Moukoko and a Fofana competing with him to just get on the bench or the squad, because Broja by no means, when fit, is an automatic starter. So absolutely, Chelsea will look, I think, for a loan or a forward who is experienced with either Premier League quality or a known name. I don't think that Fofana or Moukoko or many of these other names are about the now. And when you're only paying about 8.5 million for a player like Datro Fofana, it's not like that takes a big chunk out of any budget allocated. So Chelsea want a forward. It might be a loan and it might be a bought forward. They might wait until the summer to buy, and they might loan now, or they might move in the market and buy now. January is not going to be about mass incomings like the summer. The Chelsea fan base is perhaps a bit skewed by the summer and the fact that because we've only had 15, 16 odd games in the Premier League and then gone straight into a World Cup, the window somehow feels like a continuation of the summer. It's been non-stop links, non-stop negotiations. As soon as the window shut, they were trying to get Nkunku done. Then you play 15 games, you change your manager, you go straight into a World Cup, the window opens again. So this doesn't feel like the window ever shut. And I think everyone thinks like Chelsea are big spending. They're going to bring in tons and tons. But there's two types of signings. There's signings for the future, and they might make 3 or 4 of them. And then there's signings for now. And if they have a good window, they might make 2 or 3 of them. But I don't think we're going to see like 6, 7, 8 different names come in for the now. And January will be busy for Chelsea, probably busier than most, if not any other Premier League club. But busy in January is 2 or 3. It's not 5, 6, 7 like we saw during the summer. So I think on the striker front, and maybe not all available in January now, but Graham Potter likes Jonathan David. Graham Potter likes Ivan Toney. Graham Potter likes Dusan Vlahovic. And Vlahovic, 100% opportunity in 2023. Summer more likely than January. Toney, we need to work out what the ban is for the alleged betting breaches. And again, I don't think Brentford would allow him to be available mid-season regardless. Jonathan David didn't have a good World Cup, but his domestic numbers are still impressive. That's one to watch. I'm actually still surprised that he didn't move last summer because of the season that he had last season. But it's these type of names that are on Chelsea's radar concurrent with some of these younger strikers, because they know they need goals. They know they need experience. This is the reality of Chelsea, that I think if you look at most teams in the run for Champions League football, and we know that Chelsea are not title contenders this season, so their main aim is to somehow get into the top 4. And whether it's 4th on the final day or whether it's 2nd and there's more hope that in the second half of the season they've bridged that gap, it is kind of irrelevant. Of course, you'd prefer the latter, but even if they're bad, inconsistent, if they sneak in on the final day, nobody will really care. The most important thing is that they somehow get into the top 4. So whereas usually you would say April into May and that race to finish 4th is tight and is important, because it's a new manager, because their form wasn't good heading into the World Cup, and because of the unease about how quickly the change is happening amongst certain members of the fan base, is actually the mid-January into mid-February period that will define Chelsea's season. So stage 1 is obviously beating Bournemouth and Forest, because if they don't, then all hell is going to break loose amongst the Twitter side of the fan base. And then putting that aside, regardless of even if they take 6 points from that game, the ability to qualify for Champions League football and calm things and find some momentum and consistency is not, for me, going to come from April, May. It's going to come from January, February, simply because those fixtures are Manchester City in both the league and the FA Cup, London derbies, 2 against Fulham, 1 against Crystal Palace, 1 against West Ham. They're never easy. They've got to go away at Liverpool. They've got to go away at Spurs, and they've got to play Dortmund in the Champions League. And all of that into mid-February. I know the return leg against Dortmund is in March, but all of that first run-in is up to, I think, Valentine's Day, something around there. So either people are going to fall out of love with Graham Potter come Valentine's Day, or they're going to feel like Graham Potter's had the time and the big games in all competitions, in the league, in the Champions League, in the FA Cup, to actually have turned the season. But if Chelsea don't get the results by mid-February, because they're 8th in the table now, not 3rd or 4th, by mid-February, the gap already, I think, between Tottenham, who are in 4th, is 8 points. And yet Chelsea have got a game in hand, but it's 8 points. So if they don't get there by mid-February, it's not inconceivable to think that gap will be 12 to 15 points. And I just don't think, when you're dealing with a Newcastle in form, a Man City in form, and an Arsenal in form, an improving Man U, a Liverpool that can always pull points out the bag if they have a good January window, and a Tottenham team that might be a bit hit and miss, but they've certainly got goals in them. I think if that gap by mid-February becomes 12 or more points, Chelsea are not going to qualify for the Champions League. So this will define January for me, because unlike other seasons where that race for clubs chasing Champions League becomes important in April, May, look at the race last season between Arsenal and Spurs. and how important the North London derby was, and then Arsenal's away trip to Newcastle. And that might still be the case, by the way, for the teams competing for 4th and 5th, but specifically for Chelsea. If they haven't got the turnaround by, let's just say, Valentine's Day and mid-Feb, they will be more than 10 points adrift of Champions League football. And I don't see them coming back from that. And that's why the January window is so important.
If that does happen, will that ultimately define Potter as well, though? That's the question, because there's a lot of, I'll tell you, be honest with you, Ben, there's a couple of people on Chelsea Twitter, and I know it's a very reactionary space, and there's a lot of people out there with it, but there's some people that already feel that Graham Potter's not the right man. You know, they've already made their decisions already and what they've seen, and based on the first 15 games that we've really played. I'm one of, he needs to be given time. I still think the crop of players that he has are still part of the issue, because I just don't think some of them are good enough, especially when we suffer from injuries like we have with Reece James out, obviously Fofana and other sort of key players that are in the team. So, you know, it's gonna be interesting to see how Potter reacts. Ultimately, he will have to react, because Chelsea losing 4 in a row, I haven't seen that in a very long time. I can't even remember last time Chelsea went 4 in a row losing. Do you know what I mean? So he's going to have to respond, and he's going to have to start winning games. And you're right, you know, Nottingham Forest, Bournemouth, they're 2 games, 6 points. They have to get and kick on. And then obviously they've got that testing period that you've already rung out with Dortmund, City and Fulham and others as well. So
I think they will get 6 points, by the way. Let's not forget that. I called Argentina winning the World Cup. I called the clean sheet and the winner Everton on opening day, and I called England only getting to the quarterfinals. So clearly, when I tell you that it will be 6 points from the next 2 games in the Premier League, that comes with some sort of mystical authority.
Yeah, 100%. I can see some of the people in the chat already saying prepare for 6 to lose 6 in a row, Jim. No, go AM. I'm not preparing for it, mate. We need to win these games on the back of it. We've got hopefully a better depth squad with some people coming back in anyway. But listen, guys, let's have it up here. We've got just under 400 people here as well. It's been a great show, actually. I've really enjoyed it. Love getting back into talking Chelsea. I am going to Dubai on the 23rd, guys, which means I ain't going to be back to the 3rd of Jan. So if you don't see me for 10 days, don't think that I've done a runner. So we will be back at the beginning of the transfer window. You'll be seeing a lot more of Ben. I'm sure we can get him on through the transfer window, talking about Chelsea, giving us updates on anything that comes out on that as well. Ben, any sort of last final thoughts that you want to share with us, and obviously let the people know where they can find you as well?
Yeah, of course, at Jacobs Ben or at Ben David Jacobs. Jacobs Ben on Twitter, Ben David Jacobs on a brand new TikTok. That's also the Instagram handle, but as I say many times, it's mostly just dog photos and things of me in Christmas jumpers like this dinosaur one that I'm wearing now. And the final thought is really just that sources continue to say, but not only say, but explain. And sometimes as journalists, we're told things strictly off record rather than in background. So we don't use them in public, but sources continue close to the club to not just say there's a plan, but show there's a plan. And that includes a patience in Graham Potter, regardless of what the fan base might think if results don't go Chelsea's way over the next few weeks. So I think that is important, as frustrating as it is, as annoying as it is to hear, to be patient and realize that Chelsea have a long-term plan and they want to make Champions League football. They expect to make Champions League football. But if they don't make Champions League football, it doesn't alter a great deal, other than you would argue in the forthcoming summer window, maybe being weaker in the race for players like Declan Rice or Jude Bellingham. So it will impact things, of course, but that doesn't mean that there isn't a long-term plan. And that doesn't mean that there's not 2 plans and strategies and budgets, one for Champions League, one without Champions League. So my final thought is really just those that sort of feel like Todd Bowley's some kind of megalomaniac. He's the minority owner. He's the chairman. He's the interim sporting director. He's not appointed a sporting director. He's doing everything. He's saying everything. He's got these wacky ideas. I think they're not giving the club enough credit for what they're trying to do. And they're also not factoring in just how much turmoil Chelsea went through before they came in. So the patience comes out of the fact not only that this ownership group have to learn and appoint, but it also comes from the fact that prior to them coming in, there was so much uncertainty that, of course, on and off the field, they're behind some of their rivals because nobody knew what was going to happen. There were sanctions. The very license of the club was under threat at one point. And then they come in. It's during a transfer window. They have to change their board. They choose to change their manager. They bring in a younger manager, trying to give him an opportunity. It all adds up towards a very chaotic, very exciting, very ambitious, but very worrying period. And I know that sounds ridiculous because every single word I've said there is contradictory. How can it be exciting but worrying? How can it be ambitious but uncertain? But this is the nature of changing your model, and it will take time. And therefore, even if fans rightly, because they pay their hard-earned money, don't like a performance or a result, even if, and it's not the aim, by the way, even if they don't qualify for Champions League football, but even if they change their manager again, even if things don't go right, I just think that in a season or two, Chelsea will still be better off under this approach than worse off. And we're seeing little clues as to why through Nkunku, through some of the young talent, through the level of spending that they were prepared to pay last summer. So there's examples that show you the positives and the ambition, and there's examples that show you the uncertainty and the chaos and the fluctuation and the change. And are they moving too fast, too soon? There's a fair argument for that. But do they have to move fast because of the circumstance? There's a fair argument for that as well. So my overall feeling is that patience is an irritating word to hear for fans because they pay hard-earned money. They love their team. They know their team certainly better than I do. And they are entitled to their opinion. They are entitled to vent their frustration. And they are entitled, because they live and breathe by Chelsea, to feel annoyed when a great club like Chelsea is not succeeding trophy-wise, consistency-wise, form-wise to the same level as Roman Abramovich. So I get it. And all you can say in response to it is just see how it pans out. And it's a pretty rubbish counter-argument to these fans that are losing in their own minds money and their senses, watching it all go in the other direction at times. So it's one of those where we might come back in a season or two and people like me will be like, well, I told you so. What was all the fuss about? Or it might go in the other direction and fans will be saying we're annoyed because look at what's happened. We have to wait and see. But what I can tell you as a closing thought is just that the plan that I have heard, the plan that I have seen, extending all the way back to the pitch before they even won the club, with the pledged investment, the commitment to the women's team, the stadium redevelopment, the level of spending they said they would spend and then did prove to spend in the last window. The plan is there and it looks a good plan and it looks a solid plan. So let's just hope that it comes off and everybody calms down and has a good Christmas.
And that is the best way to probably end it on that one. I do want to wish you a Merry Christmas, Ben, and a New Year's as well. Because I probably
to everyone, Merry Christmas, happy festive period, happy Hanukkah, whatever you celebrate. I hope that everybody gets the results they want on the field and the health and success and rest off it.
Exactly that. And also all the Boxing Day football that will be treated to Premier League back as well. I'll be watching it, even in Dubai, even if I'm sitting on the beach, I'll find a sports bar. I'll be watching it.
Barasti is your bar for that.
Yes, there we go. I'll make a note of that one. But yeah, it's been great. And like I said, I'm sure we'll get you on when I'm back at the beginning of January, when obviously the window starts heating up and Chelsea start getting linked with others. And we'll definitely go through a discussion again. I've had some people message me going, really wanted to ask Ben a question. Guys, on the next show. All right. If you've got any questions and we're doing a show next time round, just drop them to me and I will try and get Ben to answer any of the questions for you. It's not a problem. But appreciate it, guys. It's been a really good show again. Just over an hour and 38 minutes as well. Merry Christmas. Have a good New Year's as well. And Thursday, I say that I'll see you. I don't know why I'm saying that as if I'm not going to see you again, but I might be back Thursday, the day before I go away, for one more show, just to open up general to you guys and give us your thoughts on Chelsea as well. But enjoy the rest of your day, guys. Take care of yourself. Ben, thank you very much, and we'll see you again very, very soon.
All the best.